So today we are in Luke chapter 8 verse 1 to 15, a very famous parable called the parable of the sower. One of my aims with these daily Moravian videos is to unpack something of the wider context and meaning of the passage. And so I'd really encourage you to do the application, to work out what God is saying to you this day through the passage, how you can apply it to your life and how you can live it out. But what I want to do today is just walk through the passage and unpack it in a few places bit by bit. So firstly, in verse 1, his good news message was all about the kingdom of God. It was a proclamation to the people that a new king was being enthroned and they were being invited to bow the knee to this new king, to Jesus. And that's important because it is first and foremost the meaning of the seed that is sown. The seed is all about the good news of the kingdom and King Jesus. I want you to also notice that in those first few verses of chapter 8, Jesus is all about team, all about leadership development. He wasn't a lone voice on a street corner. He was modeling evangelism and discipleship to his followers, to his disciples. And that radically included women and men trained together. That was unheard of in the day, to include women in that way. And those women were funding his mission. Women like Joanna, wife of Chuza, which for me sounds like a proper Scouse name. You're right, Chuza. But the context here, when you read it, is Jesus is building a new kind of oikos, a new kind of household, a centre for discipleship and mission. And Jesus draws the crowds and begins to speak in parables. Now, why did Jesus speak in parables? Well, that is a question that the disciples asked Jesus in verse 9. And a parable is a sort of short story containing hidden truth. A parable often left the people puzzled and questioning, and that is sort of the point. The parables separated out the crowds, those who were merely onlookers, with those who were going to press in and engage and search for truth like the disciples were doing. There's also an element in Jesus speaking in parables that is like a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Verse 8, Jesus calls out like an Old Testament prophet. He calls out to the people, "He who has ears, let him hear." And of course, we know throughout the whole of Israel's history that God would send the people prophets. They would speak on God's behalf. The people would hear what was spoken, but they didn't really listen. They didn't hear and understand, hear and obey. So now to the meaning of the parable. And the seed, which is always good, the quality of the seed is never in question. The seed is the good news of the kingdom. Jesus is king. Come and bow the knee. Make him the Lord of your life. And of course, then like today, the response of the people to that message varied. I think the birds remind us that in our evangelism and our witness, we are in a spiritual battle. We have a spiritual enemy who is at work. And so we need to pray, to intercede for those we are witnessing to rebuke the devil, that he would flee from them and that the gospel would take root in their lives. And so we need to sow seeds and to pray for those seeds, the soil. I think the path also reminds us of the importance of our prayer in our witness and our evangelism. We have to break up the hard ground with our prayer. That always reminds me of 2 Corinthians 10:5 that talks about demolishing arguments that hinder people from knowing God, like using a hammer to break up concrete in the ground. The weeds remind us of persecution and trouble. And Jesus says in Matthew 24:13, it's the one who endures to the end that will be saved. The thorns remind us, even today, powerfully of how consumerism and worldly worries, the pursuit of wealth, the deceitfulness of wealth, how these things can hinder maturity because they distract us from having that singular focus on the kingdom, from seeking the kingdom first. And then I think we see an incredibly challenging definition of Christian maturity. What does a mature plant look like? It looks like one that reproduces, one that produces more seed. In other words, one that wins others to Christ, that makes and multiplies new disciples. And of course, the whole point of the parable is the question, do we have ears to hear what God is saying to us through this story this day?